The sun painted the horizon blood red as Olivia Garner stood trembling on the wooden platform, hands bound behind her back, her honey blonde hair whipping across her face in the dusty Kansas wind. Rawhide was a town where fortunes were made and souls were lost, but Olivia never imagined she'd become merchandise on an auction block after her father's death left her drowning in his gambling debts. $500 for the girl, shouted a portly man with a handlebar mustache, his eyes appraising her like she was livestock. Look at that face, worth every penny to have that cooking in my kitchen and warming my bed. Raucous laughter erupted from the crowd of men gathered in Rawhide's dusty Main Street. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life out west had turned into a nightmare for 22-year-old Olivia. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been the respectable daughter of a merchant. Now, her father was buried on Boot Hill, and Clancy Sullivan, the saloon owner to whom he owed a small fortune, had decided to recoup his losses by selling her to the highest bidder. 600, called another voice, belonging to a weather-beaten rancher whose reputation for cruelty to his workers was well known throughout the territory. 700, countered a thin man with cold eyes who owned the mining operation north of town. Olivia's vision blurred with tears as the bidding continued. She had pleaded with Sullivan for mercy, offering to work off her father's debt, but the man was interested only in quick profit. The sheriff had looked away when she begged for help, muttering something about private business matters before shuffling back to his office. $800, came a deep voice from the back of the crowd. The bidders parted to reveal a tall figure on horseback. Mason Cole sat atop a chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders outlined against the setting sun. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but Olivia could make out a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble. He wasn't a man she recognized from town. Sullivan's eyes lit up at the increasing price. 800 from the stranger. Do I hear 9? The mining operator grudgingly raised a hand. 900. Mason Cole dismounted in one fluid motion and approached the platform, his spurs jangled with each deliberate step. Up close, Olivia could see his eyes were the color of a summer sky, startlingly blue in his sun-darkened face. A long scar ran from his temple to his jaw on the right side, and his expression was unreadable as he studied her. $1,000, said the portly man, glaring at Mason with open hostility. Mason reached the base of the platform and stopped, his gaze never leaving Olivia's face. My heart bids more, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. Sullivan's smile faltered. This ain't no church social, mister. Cash only. In one swift movement, Mason drew his revolver, though he kept it pointed at the ground. I said my heart bids more. This woman is not for sale. The hell she ain't. Sullivan stepped forward, his face reddening. She's mine to sell fair and square to cover her pa's debts. How much does she owe you? Mason asked, his voice deceptively calm. $1,200 plus interest. Mason reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it at Sullivan's feet, where it landed with a heavy thunk. 1,500. That covers the debt and then some. Now cut her loose. Sullivan bent to open the pouch, his greedy fingers counting the gold coins inside. His eyes widened and he nodded to one of his men. Cut her free. As the rough rope was sliced from her wrists, Olivia nearly collapsed with relief. Her legs trembled beneath her simple blue dress, and she had to grip the wooden railing to steady herself. Mason held out his hand to her. Miss, if you'll come with me, I'll see you safely away from here. She hesitated, looking into the stranger's eyes. He could be leading her into an even worse situation. She had no reason to trust this man, yet something in his steady gaze made her place her trembling hand in his. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely audible. A friend, he replied simply. For now, that's all you need to know. He helped her down from the platform and led her to his horse. With gentle hands, he lifted her into the saddle before swinging up behind her. The crowd parted silently, many of the men shuffling their feet in shame now that the spectacle had ended in such an unexpected way. As they rode out of town, Olivia felt the warmth of Mason's chest against her back, solid and reassuring. She didn't know where he was taking her or what would happen next, but for the moment she was safe from the auction block, and that was enough. They rode in silence as the town of Rawhide fell away behind them. The prairie stretched before them, bathed in the golden light of sunset. Mason guided his horse off the main trail and toward a copse of cottonwood trees that lined a small creek. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, dismounting and helping Olivia down. "It's not safe to travel after dark, and you look like you could use some rest." Olivia watched as he efficiently set up a small camp, gathering wood for a fire and unrolling his bedroll. His movements were practiced and economical, suggesting years of life on the trail. When the fire was crackling, he pulled provisions from his saddlebag: jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. "It's not much of a feast," he said, offering her a share, "but it'll keep you going." She accepted the food gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten all day. "Thank you, Mr. Cole, not just for this, but for—" Her voice faltered. "Mason," he corrected gently, "and there's no need for thanks." "There is every need," Olivia insisted. "You saved me from—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Mason's expression hardened. No decent man would stand by and watch a woman sold like cattle. "Yet the entire town of Rawhide did exactly that," she said bitterly. "Men can be wolves when they smell weakness," Mason replied. "Your father's death left you vulnerable, and Sullivan took advantage." Olivia looked at him sharply. "How do you know about my father?" Mason poked at the fire with a stick. "I've been in Rawhide for 3 days." Word travels fast in small towns, especially gossip about a merchant who gambled away his business and left his daughter to face the consequences. Shame colored Olivia's cheeks. "He wasn't always like that. After my mother died 2 years ago, something broke inside him. The gambling, the drinking. It was like he was trying to follow her to the grave." "And now you're left to pick up the pieces," Mason observed. "There aren't any pieces left to pick up," she said softly. "The store is gone, our house is gone, everything is gone." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. "What will you do now?" Mason finally asked. Olivia stared into the flames. "I don't know. I have an aunt in St. Louis, but I've no money for passage." She looked up at him. "What about you? Why did you help me? You spent a small fortune back there." Mason's face remained impassive. "Money comes and goes. Some things are worth more." "Like what?" "Like doing what's right," he said simply. Olivia studied him in the firelight. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness in the way he spoke to her, in the way he had treated her. "Are you taking me to St. Louis then?" Mason shook his head. "I've business farther west, but I know someone in the next town over who might help you. She runs a boarding house for respectable women. You could stay there while you figure out your next move." "And what would I pay her with?" Olivia asked. "I have nothing." "I'll take care of it," Mason said. "Consider it an investment in your future." Olivia frowned. "I won't be beholden to another man, Mr. Cole, no matter how noble his intentions might seem." A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "You've got spirit, Miss Garner, that'll serve you well." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather wallet. "This isn't charity, it's a loan. When you're back on your feet, you can repay me with interest if it makes you feel better." Olivia hesitated, then took the wallet. "I will repay you, every cent." "I believe you will," he said, and there was respect in his voice. As the night grew deeper and the fire burned lower, Olivia felt her eyelids growing heavy. Mason noticed and gestured to his bedroll. "Take it, I'll keep watch." "I can't take your bed," she protested. "You can and you will," he said firmly. "I've slept on harder ground than this. Rest now. We have a long ride tomorrow." Too exhausted to argue further, Olivia lay down on the bedroll. Despite her situation alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, she felt safer than she had in weeks. As sleep claimed her, her last conscious thought was of Mason Cole's unexpected kindness in a world that had shown her precious little of it lately. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Kansas prairie. Olivia woke to the scent of coffee and found Mason crouched by a small morning fire, pouring the dark liquid into a tin cup. "You're up," he observed, handing her the cup. "We should reach Clearwater by midday if we make good time." Olivia accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her chilled fingers around the warm metal. "Is that where your friend with the boarding house lives?" Mason nodded. "Widow McPherson, she's a good woman, tough as rawhide but fair. And you think she'll take me in?" She will if I ask her to, he said with certainty. They ate a quick breakfast of the remaining jerky and hardtack, then packed up camp. As Mason saddled his horse, Olivia took the opportunity to wash her face in the creek, trying to make herself as presentable as possible under the circumstances. When she returned, Mason was waiting, horse ready. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her once again. As they rode, Olivia found herself growing increasingly aware of his presence, the solid strength of his chest against her back, the clean scent of his shirt despite days on the trail, the gentle way his arms encircled her to hold the reins. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. She felt him stiffen slightly. "War," he said tersely. "You fought for the Union?" "Yes." His tone didn't invite further questions. Olivia respected his reticence, understanding that some wounds went deeper than those visible on the skin. They rode on in silence for a while longer. "What business takes you west?" she finally asked. "Cattle," he replied. "I'm meeting a herd coming up from Texas. Going to drive them to Wyoming territory." "You're a drover then," Mason chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. Sometimes I'm a rancher, sometimes I'm other things." "How mysterious," she said lightly. "Not really, just a man trying to make his way, same as anyone." The sun climbed higher in the sky as they followed the trail westward. Around midday, as Mason had predicted, they crested a small rise and saw the town of Clearwater spread out before them. It was larger than Rawhide, with more substantial buildings and signs of prosperity, a proper church with a steeple, several businesses along the main street, and houses with painted fences and small gardens. They rode into town, attracting curious glances from the locals. A man and woman sharing a saddle wasn't a common sight, even in the informal West. Mason guided his horse to a two-story house at the end of a side street. A neatly painted sign read "McPherson Boarding House for Ladies." Mason dismounted and helped Olivia down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride and she stumbled slightly. His hands caught her waist, steadying her, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. He stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "Wait here. I'll speak to Mrs. McPherson." Olivia watched as he climbed the steps to the porch and knocked on the door. A moment later, it was opened by a stout woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her expression softened visibly when she saw Mason, and she pulled him into a quick, fierce hug before ushering him inside. Left alone, Olivia straightened her rumpled dress as best she could and tried to smooth her wind-tangled hair. She felt acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and what the respectable Mrs. McPherson might think of a young woman arriving in such a state, accompanied by a man. Several minutes passed before the door opened again and Mason beckoned to her. Gathering her courage, Olivia climbed the steps and entered the boarding house. The interior was clean and modestly furnished, with polished wood floors and simple curtains at the windows. Mrs. McPherson stood in the center of the parlor, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Olivia's appearance. "So you're Olivia Garner," she said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "Mason tells me you've had a rough time of it." "Yes, madam," Olivia replied, resisting the urge to fidget under the woman's scrutiny. "He says you're looking for a fresh start." "I am." "Well, girl, I don't usually take in boarders without references, but Mason Cole's word is good enough for me, Mrs. McPherson's stern expression softened slightly. "I've got a room on the second floor. It's small, but it's clean. You can stay there while you find your feet." Relief flooded through Olivia. "Thank you, Mrs. McPherson. I promise I won't be a burden." "See that you aren't," the older woman replied briskly. "I expect all my ladies to contribute. Can you cook?" "Yes, madam, and so, I kept the books for my father's store as well." Mrs. McPherson nodded approvingly. "Good, Mrs. Fletcher at the dressmaker's shop is looking for help. I'll speak to her tomorrow. In the meantime, you look like you could use a bath and a proper meal." "I'll be going then," Mason said, reaching for his hat. "I've left enough to cover a month's board, Mrs. McPherson." "Always the gentleman," the older woman said with a hint of fondness in her voice. "When will you be back through Clearwater?" "Hard to say. The cattle drive could take most of the summer." Olivia felt a sudden pang at the thought of Mason leaving. In the short time she'd known him, he had become her only ally in a world that seemed determined to break her. "Mr. Cole," she said, stepping forward, "I don't know how to thank you properly." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "Like I said before, no thanks needed. You've got a chance at a new start now, make the most of it." "I will repay you," she promised again. "Every cent." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I know you will." He turned to Mrs. McPherson. "Take good care of her, Ellen." "I always look after my girls," Mrs. McPherson assured him. "You take care of yourself out there, Mason Cole. Wyoming Territory's still wild country." Mason nodded, placed his hat on his head, and with one last look at Olivia, stepped out the door. Olivia moved to the window, watching as he mounted his horse. As if sensing her gaze, he looked back at the house. Their eyes met through the glass, and he tipped his hat in a gesture of farewell before riding away. "Well, girl," Mrs. McPherson said behind her, "let's get you settled. The bath water's already heating." As Olivia followed the older woman up the stairs, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever see Mason Cole again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Olivia settled into her new life in Clearwater. True to her word, Mrs. McPherson had spoken to Mrs. Fletcher, and Olivia now worked 6 days a week at the dressmaker's shop. Her skill with a needle and her eye for fashion quickly made her a valuable employee, and Mrs. Fletcher had already hinted that she might be willing to take Olivia on as a partner someday. The boarding house was home to 4 other women, besides Olivia, a schoolteacher, a telegraph operator, a young widow working at the general store, and Mrs. McPherson's niece, who helped run the boarding house. They formed a tight-knit community, sharing meals and stories in the evenings, offering each other the support that women alone on the frontier so desperately needed. Olivia's room was indeed small, but it was her own space, the first she'd had since losing her home in Rawhide. She kept it meticulously clean, and with her first wages, she purchased a small vase that she filled with wildflowers gathered on her Sunday walks. On one such Sunday in early July, Olivia was returning from her walk when she noticed an unusual amount of activity in Clearwater's Main Street. A cattle drive was passing through town, and dusty cowboys were taking advantage of their brief stop to stock up on supplies, get a hot meal, or quench their thirst at the saloon. Olivia quickened her pace, not wanting to attract unwanted attention. She had nearly reached the turn for the boarding house when a familiar figure on horseback caught her eye. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Mason Cole riding alongside the herd, issuing orders to the other drovers. He looked different from when she'd last seen him, more weathered, his face covered in trail dust, his clothes worn from weeks on the drive. But there was no mistaking those broad shoulders or the way he sat his horse with such natural ease. As if drawn by her gaze, Mason turned his head and his eyes widened in recognition. He spoke briefly to another rider, then guided his horse through the milling cattle toward where Olivia stood. "Miss Garner," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "you're looking well." Olivia felt heat rise to her cheeks under his steady gaze. She was acutely aware that she was wearing her best dress, a pale blue gingham that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her make, and that her hair was neatly arranged beneath a modest straw hat. "Mr. Cole," she replied, unable to keep a smile from her face. "I didn't expect to see you so soon. I thought you were bound for Wyoming." "Change of plans," he explained. "The buyer wanted delivery in Dodge City instead. We're just passing through on our way back to Texas." "Will you be staying in Clearwater long?" she asked, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. "Just overnight, long enough to rest the men and the herd." His eyes never left her face. "How are you faring? Mrs. McPherson treating you well?" "Very well, and I have a job at the dressmaker's shop." "I've been saving to repay you." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small envelope. "It's not all of it yet, but it's a start." Mason looked at the envelope but made no move to take it. "Keep it, you might need it." "I insist," Olivia said firmly, holding the envelope out. "A debt is a debt, and I pay what I owe." Something like respect flickered in his eyes as he finally accepted the envelope, tucking it into his shirt pocket without counting the money inside. "You're doing well for yourself, then." "I am," she confirmed, "and I have you to thank for it." "You've done the hard work yourself," he countered. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the bustle of the cattle drive continuing around them. I should let you get back to your men, Olivia finally said, gesturing to the cowboys who were clearly waiting for instructions. Mason nodded. They do need herding almost as much as the cattle. He hesitated, then added, I'll be staying at the hotel tonight, perhaps you might join me for supper to catch up properly. Olivia knew she should refuse. Dining alone with a man, especially at a hotel, was not something a respectable young woman did. Yet the thought of spending more time with Mason was too tempting to resist. I would like that, she said, but perhaps we could meet at Simmons' Cafe instead. It's just across from the hotel and the food is quite good. Relief crossed Mason's face. Simmons' Cafe it is, 7 o'clock, I'll be there. With another tip of his hat, Mason turned his horse and rode back to the herd, leaving Olivia standing in the street with her heart beating faster than it had in months. When she returned to the boarding house, she found Mrs. McPherson in the kitchen, preparing the Sunday evening meal. You're back late from your walk, the older woman observed, eyeing Olivia's flushed cheeks with suspicion. I ran into an acquaintance in town, Olivia explained, trying to sound casual. A cattle drive is passing through. Mrs. McPherson's eyebrows rose. Would this acquaintance happen to be a tall, scarred man with too much charm for his own good? Olivia smiled despite herself. Mason Cole is back, yes, just for the night. Mrs. McPherson continued kneading dough for biscuits. And I suppose he asked you to supper. How did you know that? I've known that man for 15 years, girl. He's predictable in some ways. She gave Olivia a sharp look. You're planning to go? Yes, Olivia admitted. To Simmons' Cafe, it's perfectly respectable, Mrs. McPherson said again. Mason Cole is a good man in many ways, but he's not the settling kind. Remember that before you let your heart run away with you. It's just supper, Olivia protested, even as she recognized the warning in the older woman's words. To thank him for his help, nothing more, Mrs. McPherson didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue further. Well, wear your green dress. It brings out the color in your eyes. At precisely 7 o'clock, Olivia entered Simmons' Cafe. The small restaurant was bustling with townspeople and cowboys from the cattle drive, but Mason had secured a table in the corner. He stood when he saw her, and Olivia was struck by his transformation. He had bathed and shaved, and his clean clothes, while simple, gave him an air of quiet dignity. Miss Garner, he said, holding her chair for her. You look lovely. Olivia had followed Mrs. McPherson's advice and worn her green dress. From Mason's appreciative gaze, it had been the right choice. Thank you, Mr. Cole, and thank you for inviting me. Once they were seated, a waitress quickly took their order. The cafe was known for its hearty food, and the special that evening was roast beef with potatoes and fresh vegetables from Mrs. Simmons' garden. So tell me about your work at the dressmaker's, Mason said after the waitress had gone. Do you enjoy it? I do, Olivia replied earnestly. Mrs. Fletcher is a wonderful teacher, and I've always loved sewing. She's even letting me design some of the simpler garments now. You've found your place here, then? I think so. She studied him across the table. And what about you? Will you return to Texas after delivering the cattle? A shadow crossed Mason's face. For a time, I don't stay in one place long. Why not? She asked boldly. Mason was saved from answering by the arrival of their food. As they ate, the conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, news from back east that had reached Clearwater via the telegraph, the growth of the town since Mason's last visit. It was only when they were sharing a slice of Mrs. Simmons' apple pie that Olivia returned to more personal ground. Mrs. McPherson mentioned she's known you for 15 years, she said. How did you meet? Mason's expression softened. Her husband was my commanding officer during the war. A good man. When he was killed at Gettysburg, I was the one who brought his personal effects back to Ellen. That's why she trusts you so completely. We've looked out for each other over the years, Mason acknowledged. Ellen's had her share of troubles, but she's never let them break her spirit, like losing her husband, that and other things. Mason's tone suggested there was more to the story, but it wasn't his to tell. As the evening drew to a close, Mason insisted on walking Olivia back to the boarding house. The night was clear, with a crescent moon hanging low in the sky and stars scattered like diamond dust across the heavens. Thank you for supper, Olivia said as they reached the gate of the boarding house. It was nice to catch up. Mason nodded, his face half hidden in shadow. I'm glad to see you doing so well, Olivia. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it made her pulse quicken. When do you leave tomorrow? She asked, not wanting the evening to end. First light, we need to reach Dodge City by the end of the week, and then back to Texas. Yes. He hesitated, then added, though I find myself with reasons to pass through Clearwater more often these days. The implication hung in the air between them, a tentative promise that this wouldn't be the last time they saw each other. Olivia took a deep breath. I would like that, Mason. He stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Olivia Garner, he said softly. Dream well. With that, he turned and walked away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Olivia stood at the gate long after he had disappeared, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. Inside, Mrs. McPherson was waiting in the parlor, pretending to read a book. Have a nice supper, she asked, not looking up from her page. Very nice, Olivia replied, unable to keep the smile from her voice. Mrs. McPherson finally raised her eyes, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. Be careful, girl, that man has ghosts that follow him wherever he goes. Don't we all? Olivia countered gently, the older woman sighed. I suppose we do, but Masons are the kind that keep him running. Remember that. As Olivia climbed the stairs to her room, she pondered Mrs. McPherson's words. Mason Cole was indeed a man with secrets, a past he seemed reluctant to discuss. Yet there was something about him that called to her a fundamental decency, a quiet strength, and behind his reserve, a capacity for kindness that had saved her from a terrible fate. She fell asleep that night thinking of blue eyes and a gentle kiss on her hand, wondering when their paths might cross again. The answer came sooner than she expected. 2 months later, as summer gave way to early autumn, Mason Cole rode into Clearwater once more. This time, he wasn't passing through with a cattle drive but arrived alone. Staying not one night but 3 each evening, he called at the boarding house to take Olivia walking through town or to supper at the cafe. By day, he conducted mysterious business that he was reluctant to discuss, though Mrs. McPherson seemed to know more than she was telling. On the evening before his departure, Mason took Olivia to a small hill overlooking the town. They spread a blanket on the grass and watched as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. It's beautiful, Olivia said, drawing her shawl closer against the evening chill. Yes, it is, Mason agreed, though when she turned to look at him, he was watching her, not the sunset. Heat rose to her cheeks under his steady gaze. Over the past months, her feelings for Mason had deepened from gratitude to something much more profound. Each letter that arrived from him, infrequent but treasured, had only strengthened the connection between them. And now, sitting beside him as twilight descended, she found herself hoping he felt the same. Mason, she began, gathering her courage, may I ask you something? Of course. These business trips that bring you to Clearwater, are they really necessary, or is there another reason you keep coming back? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. What do you think, Olivia? I think, she said carefully, that a man who can find work wherever he goes might choose where that work takes him. You might be right about that. He reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. There's something about Clearwater that keeps drawing me back. Just Clearwater, she pressed. His smile widened. No, not just Clearwater. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Olivia, Mason said finally, his voice serious. There are things about me, about my past, that I haven't told you. I know, she said softly. Mrs. McPherson says you have ghosts. She's right. He stared into the distance. I've done things I'm not proud of. After the war, I was angry, lost. I made choices that hurt people. But you're not that man anymore. How can you be sure? Olivia turned to face him fully. Because the man you are now saved me when I needed saving. He's been kind and honorable. He writes letters that make me smile. He rides hundreds of miles just to walk me to supper. She reached for his hand. I don't need to know every detail of your past, Mason. I know who you are now, and that's enough for me. Mason's fingers tightened around hers. You make me want to be better than I am. You already are, she whispered. This time, when he leaned toward her, there was no mistaking his intention. His kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When Olivia responded, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, the kiss deepened into something that made her heart race and her breath catch. When they finally pulled apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I have to leave tomorrow, I know, but I'll be back, he promised. As soon as I can, I'll be here, she said simply. The following morning, Olivia stood on the porch of the boarding house as Mason prepared to ride out. He had already said his goodbyes to Mrs. McPherson, who had retreated inside with suspicious moisture in her eyes. 1 month, Mason said, checking the cinch on his saddle. 2 at the most. I need to settle some business in Texas, and then I'll be back. I'll hold you to that, Olivia replied, trying to keep her voice light despite the heaviness in her heart. Mason mounted his horse, then leaned down from the saddle. Olivia Garner, in case it wasn't clear. I'm falling in love with you. Joy bloomed in her chest. In case it wasn't clear, Mason Cole, I'm already there. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. With one last kiss, quick but full of promise, he straightened in the saddle and rode away. Olivia watched until he disappeared around the bend in the road, her fingers pressed to her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. Behind her, Mrs. McPherson cleared her throat. Well, girl, it seems Mason Cole might finally be ready to stop running. Do you think so? Olivia asked, turning to the older woman. Mrs. McPherson's stern face softened. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. That man would ride through fire to get back to you now. The days stretched into weeks as Olivia waited for Mason's return. The leaves on the cottonwood trees turned golden and began to fall, carpeting Clearwater's streets. The air grew crisper, and the first frost touched the prairie grass. Mason's letters arrived regularly, each one filled with plans for the future, their future. He wrote of a small ranch he was considering buying, not in Texas but closer to Clearwater, of horses he wanted to raise, of a life they might build together. Reading between the lines, Olivia sensed he was putting his past to rest, settling accounts both financial and emotional before starting anew. In her replies, she told him of her progress at the dressmaker's shop, of Mrs. Fletcher's offer to make her a full partner when she had saved enough for her share of the business, of her dreams that now invariably included him. 6 weeks after Mason's departure, Olivia was at work in the shop when the door opened, admitting a cold gust of November wind and a stranger. He was a thin man with hard eyes, expensively dressed but with a coarseness that his fine clothes couldn't disguise. Can I help you, sir, Mrs. Fletcher asked, looking up from her sewing. I'm looking for Olivia Garner, the man said, his gaze sweeping the shop until it settled on Olivia. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the door. I'm Olivia Garner. The man's thin lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, Clancy Sullivan said you were a pretty one, but he didn't do you justice. At the mention of Sullivan's name, Olivia's blood ran cold. Who are you? Name's Harlan Wade. I own several businesses in Dodge City. He removed his hat, revealing slicked back hair the color of old brass. I've come to settle a debt. I don't owe anyone in Dodge City, Olivia said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Not your debt, darlin', Mason Coles. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, her motherly face creased with concern. Olivia, who is this man? I don't know, Olivia replied, never taking her eyes off Wade. What does Mason supposedly owe you? $5,000, Wade said casually. Plus interest. That's absurd, Olivia protested. Mason would have mentioned such a debt. Would he? Wade raised an eyebrow. Men like Cole don't tell their women everything, especially about their gambling habits. Mason doesn't gamble, Wade laughed, a harsh sound that grated on her nerves. Honey, every man gambles on something. Cole's weakness was poker. Usually he was good at it, took plenty of my money over the years. But 6 months ago, he had a run of bad luck. Borrowed heavy to try to win it back and lost that too. Olivia shook her head, refusing to believe it. If what you're saying is true, why come to me? Why not find Mason? Oh, I found him, Wade said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. In fact, my men are holding him right now. He suggested I might find you more cooperative than him. Fear shot through Olivia like lightning. What have you done to him? Nothing permanent, yet. Wade replaced his hat. Cole has 2 assets worth the money he owes me, a nice herd of horses he just purchased. And you? Me. Sullivan told me all about the auction that never happened in Rawhide. Seems Cole spoiled a good business opportunity there. Wade's eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. I'm willing to forgive Cole's debt in exchange for you coming to work in one of my establishments in Dodge City. Work, Olivia repeated flatly, understanding perfectly what kind of work he meant. It's a fair trade, Wade insisted. Cole seems to think you're worth more than $5,000. I'm inclined to find out if he's right. Mrs. Fletcher moved to Olivia's side, her plump face flushed with anger. You get out of my shop this instant, you vile man. I'm going to fetch the sheriff. Wade's hand moved to his coat, where the outline of a pistol was visible. I wouldn't do that if I were you, madam. This is between me, Cole, and Miss Garner. Where is Mason? Olivia demanded. My men are holding him at the old Miller place outside town. You know it, Olivia nodded. The abandoned farmhouse had stood empty for years after the Miller family moved on to California. You have until sundown to decide, Wade continued. Either you come with me to Dodge City or Cole pays his debt another way. He patted his gun meaningfully. I'll be waiting at the Miller place for your answer. With that, he tipped his hat and left the shop, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with fear. Mrs. Fletcher immediately rushed to Olivia's side. Oh, my dear girl, we must tell the sheriff at once. No, Olivia said, thinking quickly. Wade's men are watching Mason. If the sheriff rides out there, they might kill him before help arrives. Then what will you do? Olivia's mind was racing. She had no way of knowing if Wade was telling the truth about Mason's gambling debts, but the threat to Mason's life was all too real. I need to speak to Mrs. McPherson. Mrs. Fletcher nodded. Go, I'll mind the shop, but Olivia, her kind eyes were filled with worry. Be careful. Olivia hurried through Clearwater's streets to the boarding house. She found Mrs. McPherson in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the same vigor she applied to all tasks. Ellen, Olivia said, using the older woman's given name for the first time. I need your help. Mrs. McPherson took one look at Olivia's face and wiped her hands on her apron. What's happened? Quickly, Olivia explained about Wade's visit and his claims about Mason's gambling debt. When she finished, Mrs. McPherson was silent for a long moment, her weathered face grave. I was afraid something like this might happen. Then it's true, Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason really owes this man money. Not exactly. Mrs. McPherson sighed heavily. Sit down, girl. There's something you should know about Mason Cole. Olivia sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly weak. Mason wasn't always the man, you know, Mrs. McPherson began. After the war, he was. Lost, angry, he fell in with some hard men, became a bounty hunter for a time, tracking down wanted men for the reward money. That's not so terrible, Olivia said, clinging to her image of Mason as a good man. No, but it led him to darker work. Some powerful men in places like Dodge City and Deadwood found that Mason had a talent for finding people who didn't want to be found. He became what they called a debt collector. He'd track down men who owed money to gamblers, saloon owners, and worse. Sometimes, he'd bring back the money. Sometimes just the man. Olivia felt sick. You're saying Mason worked for men like Wade for a time, Mrs. McPherson confirmed. But about a year ago, something changed. He showed up here in the middle of the night, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Wouldn't tell me exactly what happened, but he said he was done with that life. Wanted to go straight, raise horses instead of hell. And you think his past has caught up with him. I think Harlan Wade is the kind of man who doesn't let his possessions go easily. And for years, Mason Cole was a valuable possession. Olivia stood, her mind made up. I have to help him. How? Mrs. McPherson asked. Wade is dangerous, girl. He's not just some frontier bully like Sullivan. He has men, money, and connections. I don't know yet, Olivia admitted. But I can't leave Mason in their hands. She looked at the older woman pleadingly. Will you help me? Mrs. McPherson's stern face softened. Mason Cole saved my life once when men like Wade came looking for my late husband's gambling debts. I won't abandon him now. She thought for a moment. I might know someone who can help. Give me an hour. True to her word, 1 hour later, Mrs. McPherson returned to the boarding house with a stranger in tow, a lean, weather-beaten man with a marshal's badge on his chest. Olivia, this is U.S. Marshal Frank Donovan, Mrs. McPherson said. He happened to be passing through Clearwater on his way to Fort Dodge. Marshal, this is Olivia Garner. The marshal tipped his hat. Miss Garner, Ellen tells me you've had a visit from Harlan Wade. Yes, sir. Olivia quickly recounted Wade's threat. Marshal Donovan's expression grew grim. I've been trying to build a case against Wade for years. He's careful, though, keeps his hands clean while his men do the dirty work. Will you help us rescue Mason? Olivia asked anxiously. I will, but we need to be smart about this. Wade's men won't hesitate to kill Cole if they see a lawman coming. He glanced at Mrs. McPherson. Ellen says you care for this man. I do, Olivia said without hesitation. Then you're going to play a part in this. It's dangerous, but it might be our best chance to save Cole and finally put Wade behind bars. As the marshal outlined his plan, Olivia felt fear twist in her stomach. What he was suggesting was risky, potentially deadly. But when she thought of Mason, who had saved her without hesitation, who had looked at her with such tenderness, who had promised to return to her, she knew she had no choice. I'll do it, she said firmly. Tell me what to do. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Olivia rode alone toward the Miller place. She had changed into her best dress, the green one that Mason liked, and wore a warm cloak against the November chill. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and to anyone watching, she looked like a woman who had made a difficult decision. The abandoned farmhouse came into view as she crested a small rise. It was a forlorn structure, its windows dark and empty, its barn listing to one side. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign that the place wasn't completely deserted. As she approached, the door of the farmhouse opened, and Harlan Wade stepped onto the porch. Behind him, she could see two rough-looking men, and between them, a figure with his hands tied behind his back, Mason. Even from a distance, Olivia could see that Mason had been beaten. His face was bruised, a trail of dried blood running from his temple to his jaw. When he saw her approaching, his expression twisted with anguish. Olivia, no, he shouted. Go back, it's a trap. One of Wade's men backhanded him across the face, silencing him. Olivia forced herself to continue forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She stopped her horse a few yards from the porch, her eyes locked with Mason's. I've come to make a deal, Mr. Wade, she called out, proud that her voice didn't tremble. Wade smiled, the expression reptilian in its coldness. I knew you'd see reason, Miss Garner. A smart woman knows when to cut her losses. Let Mason go, she demanded, and I'll go with you to Dodge City. Olivia, don't do this, Mason struggled against his captors. Whatever he's told you, it's not worth it, Wade chuckled, touching the brave cowboy trying to protect his lady love. He gestured to one of his men. Bring him out here, let him say a proper goodbye before we go. The men dragged Mason onto the porch steps. Despite his injuries, he stood straight, his eyes never leaving Olivia's face. Dismount, Miss Garner, Wade instructed. Let's conclude our business face to face. Slowly, Olivia slid from her saddle. As her feet touched the ground, she fumbled with the clasp of her cloak, as if adjusting it against the cold. I have your word that Mason goes free, she asked, taking a step forward. Of course, Wade said smoothly. I'm a businessman, not a monster. You're a liar and a coward, Wade, Mason spat. Using a woman to settle a score with me, Wade's face darkened. Watch your mouth, Cole, the lady has made her choice. He's right, Mason, Olivia said, moving closer to the porch. I've made my choice. As she reached the bottom step, her fingers closed around the small derringer hidden in the folds of her cloak, the gun Mrs. McPherson had pressed into her hands before she left. And I choose him, she said, raising the derringer and pointing it directly at Wade's chest. For a moment, everyone froze in shock, then Wade's surprise gave way to amusement. Well, the little dove has talons. He seemed unconcerned by the small gun in her hand. What do you plan to do with that toy, Miss Garner? Shoot us all. Just you, if necessary, Olivia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Let Mason go and we'll be on our way. Wade's men had drawn their own weapons, but they looked to their boss for instructions. "You're either very brave or very foolish," Wade said, his amusement fading. "That little gun might put a hole in me, but my men will cut you both down before I hit the ground." "Perhaps," came a new voice from behind the farmhouse, "but my men will do the same to yours." Marshal Donovan stepped into view, his rifle trained on Wade. From various points around the property, 4 deputies emerged from hiding, all with weapons at the ready, Wade's face contorted with rage. "Donovan, should have known you'd stick your nose in my business." "Harlan Wade, you're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and about a dozen other charges I've been saving up for you." The marshal's voice was cold as he approached, his rifle never wavering. "Tell your men to drop their weapons." For a tense moment, it seemed Wade might resist. Then, with a curse, he signaled to his men, who reluctantly lowered their guns. As the deputies moved in to secure Wade and his men, Olivia rushed up the steps to Mason. One of the deputies cut his bonds, and Olivia threw herself into his arms, heedless of the tears streaming down her face. "You're hurt," she said, gently touching the bruise on his cheek. "I'll live," he said, his arms tightening around her. "Olivia, what were you thinking? He could have killed you." "He was going to kill you," she replied simply. "I couldn't let that happen." Marshal Donovan approached them, his weathered face creased in a slight smile. "Miss Garner played her part perfectly, Cole. You should be proud of her." Mason looked between them, confusion evident in his battered face. "You two planned this, Mrs. McPherson found the marshal in town," Olivia explained. "We knew Wade wouldn't suspect a trap if I came alone." "Still a damn fool risk," Mason muttered, but there was grudging admiration in his voice. "Speaking of risks," the marshal said, his expression turning serious, "we need to talk about your past association with Wade, Cole. I might need your testimony to make these charges stick." Mason nodded, his arm still around Olivia's waist. "I'll tell you everything I know. It's time I made amends for the things I've done." As the deputies led Wade and his men to waiting horses, Mason turned to Olivia, his eyes full of regret. "I should have told you the truth about my past. You deserve to know the kind of man you were getting involved with, Mrs. McPherson told me some of it," Olivia said gently. "The rest you can tell me yourself when you're ready. And if what I tell you changes how you feel about me," Olivia touched his face, tracing the scar that ran along his jaw. "Mason Cole, I fell in love with you because of who you are now, not who you were then. Nothing you tell me will change that." Relief washed over his face, and he leaned down to kiss her, heedless of their audience. When they broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "When this is all sorted out," he said softly, "I still want that future we talked about. The ranch, the horses, a life together, if you'll have me." Olivia smiled through her tears. "I'll have you, Mason Cole, for better or worse." As they rode back to Clearwater together, the setting sun gilding the prairie grass, Olivia felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Mason had his past to reckon with, and she had her own dreams to pursue. But they would face whatever came together, bound by a love that had begun with an act of courage and grown into something neither of them had expected to find. In the months that followed, Mason testified against Harlan Wade, helping to send the man to prison for a long list of crimes. It wasn't easy for him to confront his past, to admit to the darkness he had been part of, but with Olivia by his side, he found the strength to do what was right. When the trial was over, they returned to Clearwater, where Mason purchased a small ranch 10 miles outside of town. It wasn't much to begin with: a modest house, a sturdy barn, and a few hundred acres of good grazing land, but it was theirs. Olivia continued her partnership with Mrs. Fletcher, dividing her time between the dressmaking shop in town and the ranch. She found she had a talent for designing practical yet fashionable clothing for frontier women, and word of her skills spread throughout the county. Mason, true to his word, began raising horses. He had an eye for good stock and a gentle way with the animals that even the most skittish colts responded to. Within a year, the Cole Ranch was known for producing some of the finest horses in Kansas. They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony in Clearwater's church. Mrs. McPherson dabbed suspiciously at her eyes throughout. and Mrs. Fletcher created a wedding dress for Olivia that was the talk of the town for months afterward. As they exchanged vows, Olivia looked into Mason's eyes and saw no trace of the restlessness that had once driven him. In its place was a contentment, a certainty that he had finally found where he belonged. Their life together wasn't without challenges. The frontier was a harsh place with droughts, blizzards, and all manner of natural disasters to contend with. There were times when money was tight, when crops failed or horses took sick. And occasionally, shadows from Mason's past would resurface, requiring them to face old enemies or settle old scores. But through it all, they had each other. The love that had begun when Mason refused to let Olivia be sold to the highest bidder grew deeper with each passing year, strengthened by shared trials and triumphs. 5 years to the day after they first met, Mason and Olivia stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching their 3-year-old son, Samuel, chasing fireflies in the twilight. Olivia's hand rested on her swollen belly where their second child kicked impatiently. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Spending all that money to save a stranger from an auction block," Mason smiled, pulling her closer against his side. "Best investment I ever made. Even better than your prize stallion," she teased. "Even better than that," he affirmed, his eyes twinkling. "Though don't tell Thunder I said so. He's vain enough as it is." Olivia laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I never did repay you in full for that money, did I?" "Oh, I think you've paid me back 1,000 times over," Mason said, his voice growing serious. "You gave me a home, Olivia, a family, a reason to be a better man. What's $1,500 compared to that?" As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they called Samuel in for supper. The little boy came running, his father's blue eyes shining in his sun-browned face, chattering excitedly about the fireflies and the foal that had been born in the barn that morning. Mason scooped him up, and together the family went inside their home. The lamp in the window cast a warm glow across the porch, a beacon in the gathering darkness, a promise of shelter and love to all who might pass by. And so it came to be that a chance encounter at an auction block in a dusty Kansas town led to a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives. In saving Olivia, Mason had found his own redemption. In loving Mason, Olivia had discovered her own strength. Together, they had built something neither could have imagined that day in Rawhide, a life not just of survival, but of joy. For in the wild and untamed West, where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card and life itself was often a gamble, they had placed the highest bid of all their hearts and won the greatest prize, a love that would last a lifetime.